Wow, you weren't kidding around with these sources about the East India Company. We've got everything here. This is great. Looks like you're going for the whole picture, huh? Not just the history of the company, but how it still affects us today, am I right?
You hit the nail on the head. It's a story that's captivating, thrilling, and yeah, a little unsettling at times.
Buckle up, everyone. We're diving deep into the East India Company.
From humble beginnings trading spices to practically ruling an entire subcontinent, this company really left its mark on the world.
Okay, so just to set the scene for folks who might not be experts, imagine the East India Company as, like, the Google of its day. Except instead of search results, they were after spices.
Love that analogy. Picture Europe in the 1600s and everyone is obsessed with spices, especially pepper.
Pepper was like
The social media influencer of its time.
right. And the only way to get it was this long, perilous journey controlled by who else? The Portuguese.
Exactly. So a group of ambitious English merchants, they see an opportunity and say, why not us? And boom, the East India Company is born.
And that's where Queen Elizabeth I enters the picture, right? She's the one who gave them that famous royal charter.
In 1600, yep. It was essentially a 15-year monopoly on trade with the East Indies. Talk about a head start.
Modern-day Indonesia, just so everyone's clear. But really, that royal charter, that was basically the Queen saying, go make England rich, go get those spices.
It really shows how closely the crown and commerce were linked back then. This wasn't just permission to trade, it was a royal endorsement.
And boy, did they take that endorsement and run with it. One of your notes here mentions Surat in 1612. What was so special about Surat?
Surat became their first major trading post. Ah, so they finally arrive, all those spices just waiting.
Hold on. It wasn't exactly a walk in the park setting it up. Imagine sailing across the globe using the stars and some pretty basic maps.
No GPS back then.
Nope. And on top of that, you're battling storms, disease. You're trying to negotiate deals in a language you can barely understand.
Talk about a language barrier. And your notes mentioned how many ships never even made it, lost at sea.
The risks were enormous. It's incredible anyone survived those voyages, let alone managed to establish successful trade routes.
Talk about dedication. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? Those little peppercorns in our kitchens represent a whole lot of adventure, risk, and ambition. But it wasn't all smooth sailing from there, right?
Oh, if only. As the company grew, their ambitions grew right along with them. Let's just say they weren't content with just trading spices anymore. Uh-oh. Sounds like things are about to get a little complicated.
Complicated is putting it lightly. They started acquiring land, building forts, even assembling their own armies.
Wait, hold on. This was still a company, right? Business.
You got it, but they were starting to act a lot more like, well, a sovereign nation.
Okay, now that is a recipe for some interesting situations, to say the least. Which brings us to the Battle of Plassey in 1757.
Ah, Plassey, a pivotal moment in the East India Company's story, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I have to admit, though, when I think of major turning points in business history, a bloody battle isn't usually what comes to mind.
It really highlights just how entangled trade and conquest had become for the company by then. We're talking a relatively small British force backed by the company going head-to-head with the Nawab of Bengal.
The Nawab of Bengal, that was like the big boss, the ruler of that entire region, right? So how does a company even win a fight against a whole army? It's like David and Goliath, but with way more gunpowder involved.
Strategy was key. The company, led by Robert Clive, they managed to get Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's own generals, on their side.
Oh, so they had an inside man.
You could say that. Mir Jafar agreed to switch sides during the battle, throwing the Nawab's forces into chaos.
Talk about playing both sides, but I'm guessing that tactic came with some, shall we say, ethical gray areas.
Definitely. While Clive returned to England a hero, the victory at Plassey was, and still is, surrounded by controversy. The deal with Mir Jafar, who basically became a puppet ruler afterward, well, it raised some serious questions about the company's methods.
Because it wasn't just about outsmarting an opponent on the battlefield anymore.
Right. It was about manipulation, about exploiting existing tensions for their own gain. A bit of a moral tightrope walk, even for the time.
Definitely makes you think twice about the idea of a hero, right? History can be pretty complicated, but there's no denying that Plassey was a major turning point for the East India Company.
Oh, absolutely. This win gave them Bengal, one of the wealthiest parts of India at the time.
We're talking resources, prime trade routes.
And a whole lot of tax revenue, all flowing directly into the company's pockets. It essentially set the stage for them to take control of most of India.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about the level of power this one company had amassed. I mean, your research mentions they had their own army, their own currency, even their own court system. They weren't just a company anymore. They were basically a country within a country.
That's why the term company state gets used a lot when talking about the East India Company. Now, ethically speaking, there were tons of problems, but this model, it was incredibly effective for the time. Decisions could be made quickly, bureaucracy was minimized. They had a huge advantage over traditional governments.
Sounds efficient, I'll give them that, but also incredibly risky, right? No real oversight, a private entity calling the shots, enforcing laws with their own army. What could possibly go wrong?
Unfortunately, a lot can go wrong when you have that much power concentrated in one place with very little accountability.
And the consequences, I'm guessing, were.
Devastating. The Bengal famine of 1770 is a prime example. While there were multiple factors that led to it, historians agree that the company's policies, which were all about squeezing as much profit as possible from cash crops like opium and indigo, well, they played a significant role in a famine that killed millions.
A stark reminder. The economic gain for some can often come at a terrible human cost for others. So we're seeing both the incredible economic power and the very dark side of this company-state model. But their impact, it wasn't just limited to India, was it?
Not at all. The East India Company's story is basically a crash course in globalization. Think about it. They completely reshaped global trade routes.
They were shipping us all over the place.
Exactly. And they created a huge demand for things like tea, silk, porcelain, all across the world. This, of course, led to whole new industries popping up, both in England and in the colonies.
It's amazing how a company from, what, like 400 years ago can still have such a huge impact on us today.
I know, it really makes you think. And their influence is everywhere. I mean, even something as simple as, like, a cup of tea.
You're saying my morning Earl Grey is a direct line back to the East India Company.
Think about it, that single cup of tea represents a whole culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
But behind it is this tangled web of trade, colonialism, the East India Company's stamp on history. It's all connected.
Wow, I never thought of it like that. It's a good reminder that the things we often take for granted, they have surprisingly complex and, let's be honest, sometimes kind of dark beginnings.
Exactly. We can't talk about the East India Company without acknowledging the downsides. Colonialism, exploitation, the social and economic turmoil they inflicted on places like India.
Right, because their actions still have repercussions today, don't they?
Absolutely. The East India Company's rise and fall, it raises some really critical questions about corporate responsibility, the ethics of globalization, the lasting effects of colonialism. And these are questions that are maybe even more relevant today than ever before.
It's almost eerie how it's like looking in a distorted mirror, isn't it? We've got these massive multinational companies today with incredible power, wealth, influence, sometimes operating like mini countries themselves.
Right. And that takes us right back to that idea of company states. It's like we're still wrestling with that dynamic today, just in a different form.
It makes you wonder, have we really made any progress since then? I mean, are we any better at making sure these global giants act ethically and responsibly?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But I think the East India Company's story can teach us a lot. It's both a cautionary tale, like, hey, watch out, this could happen again, but also, I think, a push for change. It reminds us that we can't just sit back and be passive in this globalized world. We have to be informed, we have to hold these powerful entities accountable, and we have to fight for a system that's fair for everyone, not just a select few.
Well said. It seems like the story of the East India Company, it's definitely not over, is it?
Not by a long shot. It forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths, challenge assumptions, and really think about the power and responsibility that comes with global trade and influence.
And on that note, I think we've done our due diligence for today. That was a deep dive into the East India Company, if I've ever heard one. We covered everything from spices and sea voyages to empire building and the very nature of corporate power.
And hopefully we've given everyone listening a lot to think about as well.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this fascinating exploration, everyone. Until next time.